All right, what's going on, you guys? Nick here with Nick's Trying the Power. So, as many of you know, in 2018, there's going to be a new movie coming out about the life of Joe Weider. So, Joe Weider is basically the guy that started the IFBB. So, I thought it'd be interesting to make a video about one of Joe Weider's most famous rivalries with Vince McMahon. Now, Joe Weider obviously had many different rivalries throughout his illustrious career. And essentially what he did was monopolized the sport of bodybuilding. There were many rival federations, there were many rival promoters, but his rivalry with Vince McMahon was probably one of the biggest in terms of publicity and overall just notoriety that Vince McMahon had. So just to give you guys a little background on Joe Weider and the IFBB, he founded the IFBB with his brother Ben back in 1946. So the IFBB has been around for 71 years already, making it one of the most illustrious and longest running bodybuilding federations of all time. So for the unaware, the IFBB is the International Federation of Bodybuilders. And it is the same organization that holds the Mr. Olympia competition every single year, which is the most prestigious title in all of bodybuilding. So let's fast forward to the 1990 Mr. Olympia. So this is where Vince McMahon would first make his move on challenging the Weider Empire. So Vince McMahon initially started a magazine called Bodybuilding Lifestyles. And by starting that magazine, he was able to get a booth at the 1990 Mr. Olympia Expo. So as you guys know, at all these major bodybuilding shows, they typically have expos where they allow vendors, supplement companies, magazine companies to display their goods and advertise and interact with their fans and sell product. So Vince McMahon got a booth at the 1990 Olympia under the guise of this magazine. So this was a very strategic move by Vince McMahon. Number one, 1990 was a very significant year for the Olympia and for the Arnold Classic because 1990 was the only year in history that they ever drug tested the Mr. Olympia competition. So overall, to be honest, that year's Mr. Olympia was a very weak lineup. All the bodybuilders looked very off. They didn't look like they used to look because a lot of them were getting off their drug cycles to maybe try to pass these drug tests. So some of them looked very soft, some of them looked very flat, some of them looked very small. And as a result, this was really a bad year for the IFBB. A lot of people lost interest that year because nobody really looked that impressive. And that would be why they stopped drug testing the Mr. Olympia. So strategically, at that 1990 Mr. Olympia, when the competition was over and everyone had seen kind of the disappointing show that year, Vince McMahon's booth at the Olympia started handing out flyers for his very first ever WBF bodybuilding championships. So that was where he started the World Bodybuilding Federation, aka the WBF, starting September 15th, 1990. So it's kind of interesting that Vince McMahon only paid $5,000 for that booth at that Mr. Olympia competition, and that would be the catalyst for beginning his own organization. So obviously in 1990, many of you already know that was Lee Haney's 7th Mr. Olympia win, and you would have Lee Labrada in second. So towards the end of that ceremony, after Lee Haney got his trophy, that's when Vince McMahon had these models go through the audience and hand out these handbills saying, Vince McMahon was starting the WBF and this is how bodybuilding was meant to be. And that's where he started the advertisement for it. Then later that night, when all the contestants from that Olympia would be going back to their hotel rooms, they would go to the McCormick Center Hotel in Chicago. And Vince McMahon had already slipped the WBF contract offers under their doors by the time they had returned from the stage. And from that point, he actually signed 13 IFBB bodybuilders for his first press conference announcing the WBF. Even though after Ben Weider found out about this contract thing, he said he put out a press statement saying he would be giving a lifetime ban to any bodybuilder from the IFBB that would sign those WBF contracts that they found under their door. But Ben Weider claimed he was not mad at Vince McMahon. He just thought it was a very dishonorable thing for Vince to do. So basically, Ben and Joe Weider tried to act like they weren't really worried about it, and they said other federations have tried this before, and they've come and gone. But the one thing they knew, and they didn't really want to admit, was the fact that bodybuilding severely lacked TV coverage and press coverage, and Vince McMahon seemed to have really all the connections with TV and cable and broadcasting and press that the Weiders didn't really have. So this was one thing that he had in his favor going into the WBF, and this is one of the things that he planned to capitalize on, was the ability to put this on TV. Now, the other thing that Vince McMahon had in his favor is that he was going to be offering all of his bodybuilders salaries. So basically the way that things worked over with the IFBB, you had to either win a major show or place highly at a major show to make any money. And you also had to have a magazine contract back in those days. And the Weiders essentially controlled the magazine industry. So if you were with the IFBB and you were a good bodybuilder, you would probably land a magazine contract with the Weiders. And that would be what would keep you around in the IFBB. But the main star of WBF, for example, was Gary Stridham, and he would win both of the WBF championships, and his salary was said to be almost $500,000 a year, which for the early 1990s was a lot of money for a bodybuilder to be guaranteed, aside from whether or not they won, aside from all the contracts, supplement sponsorships. $400,000, $500,000 guaranteed was a ton of money for a bodybuilder, and other bodybuilders were seeing this and leaving the IFBB to come get their own contracts. So some of the names included Aaron Baker, Mike Christian, Vince Comerford, David Dirth, Barry DeMay, Johnny Morant, Danny Padilla, Tony Pearson, Jim Quinn, Mike Quinn, Eddie Robinson, obviously Gary Stridham, and Troy Zuccolatto, and they were called the WBF Body Stars. But the Weider brothers took every opportunity to remind their bodybuilders that Vince McMahon required a similar deal with his body stars as he did with his wrestlers. They were required to appear multiple times per year at promotional appearances, in excess of 50 appearances per year, which for a bodybuilder is a lot of appearances when you're trying to diet and prep for a show. And this was something that the IFBB never required of its bodybuilders, although there were guest posings and things like that. They were optional. And of course, the Weider brothers repeatedly enforced and reminded the bodybuilders of that lifetime ban that would be handed out if they left the IFBB. So the first competition with the WBF was held in 1991. This would be a live pay-per-view in Atlantic City, New Jersey. They had Bobby Heenan and Regis Philbin host the event. And despite the fact that in the initial press conference regarding the WBF, they had Tom Platz, who was obviously a legendary IFBB bodybuilder, they were asking Tom Platz about the nature of the WBF. And Tom Platz specifically said they were going to keep pro wrestling out of bodybuilding. It was going to be nothing like pro wrestling. But despite what Tom Platz said, Vince McMahon ended up trying to make these bodybuilders into something they really weren't, and gave each bodybuilder a character and kind of a pro wrestling persona, and they would kind of do a skit before they would go on stage. And overall, I think the diehard bodybuilding fans didn't really like that, and it wasn't really something they were interested in. So for that 91 competition, you had Gary Stridham win, you had Mike Christian in second, Barry DeMay in third, Jim Quinn in fourth, Eddie Robinson in fifth. And then in 1992, which would be the final WBF championships, Gary Stridham would win again, Jim Quinn would get second, Aaron Baker would get third, Barry DeMay would get fourth, and David Dirth would get fifth. So that 1992 championships, apparently the pay-per-view buys were absolutely terrible. And after that event, Vince McMahon realized it wasn't going to work. He called Ben and Joe Weider on July 15th, 1992, and he told them that the WBF was going to disband, and it was not successful. So even though Vince McMahon is one of the most successful promoters of all time in terms of pro wrestling, he was not able to defeat the Weider Empire. And that just goes to show how strong the IFBB really has become and how powerful the Weider Empire really is. That somebody like Vince McMahon with all these talents, all this money, all these connections, couldn't even bring down the IFBB. So I think the IFBB is probably here to stay. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below about the Weiders versus McMahon. Please give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Nick Strength and Power, signing out.